Right, here we are. Welcome back, everybody, to conversation number 57 with our returning guest, Mr. Matt Policastro. He's going to talk to us today about sequential test planning. He has done a little update to the planning calculator, and whatnot that was originally created by former SDIer Merritt Aho. And he's going to talk to us mostly around what sequential testing is, why we even need it, why somebody might want to use it, and then a little sneak peek to the platform and why you might want to use it. I will say that we're going to do some local reviews of it, then some back-end tweaks, and then Matt will let us know when it's available to everybody for you all to be able to use. But first, a little intro for those who don't know Matt. And Matt, a little apology. Matt is a data scientist, senior manager of optimization at Search Discovery. He has his MS in business analytics. Nothing makes him more suspicious than a winning test, nor should it. He specializes in experimental design, statistics, and helping others develop analytical intuition. Here's the little apology. His favorite pastimes include building simulators, training to achieve in said efforts of helping others develop analytical intuition, being an all-around super nice guy, and being locked in the eternal struggle for dominance with the FedEx delivery guy. And I'll let you decide whether or not you want to share the reason for that. I'm going to stop share and pass the screen share to you, sir.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, well, since you've brought that up, I feel compelled to explain myself while I got slides and things up on the screen. So I was lucky enough to be married last spring, which was lovely. And as many people do, we had a wedding registry. And in the process, we had gotten some dishware that was delivered via FedEx. And our front door is on the upstairs landing. And our delivery guy really loves not having to take those stairs. So we had to get a few things delivered 4 or 5 times because I kept opening up boxes of just shattered porcelain. So yeah, FedEx could stand to do better, but we've gotten a new delivery guy since then, so it's all good. But anyway, for the reason we're actually here today. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Matt Policastro. I'm with Search Discovery, and today we're going to be talking about sequential A/B testing. So to give us a quick rundown of what we want to cover today, we're just going to start with some basic testing statistics. This is probably for this group going to be a lot of review, nothing particularly shocking, but I did want to make sure that we were on the same page. We're then going to talk about some of kind of basic test lifecycle, again, expectations and fundamentals that folks are going to probably know. And do we have someone coming off mute for a question or? Okay, cool. And then, so we're going to talk about basic test life cycle, and then we're going to start talking about peaking and multiple testing. You've probably heard some of those terms before, and if you're not already super familiar with them, but I just want to talk through kind of how that fits into the work that we do as experimenters and optimizers, and then talk about some core principles, and then do an application tour. I will say that, as Kelly mentioned, as always happens when trying to do a live demo, as I was pushing this up right before, just make sure that the last updates were good to go. It was not playing nice. So I'm going to be showing you all a local version of the calculator. This is what's going to be going live very soon. It's just, again, want to make sure that it's all ironed out and buttoned up and behaving nicely before I put it out there, as opposed to throwing errors and disrupting people's work. And then we'll just have some time for Q&A at the end. But that all being said, let's just dive right in. And I did want to start actually with some acknowledgements. So I wanted to start off by first thanking Georgi Georgiev. So if you're not familiar with Georgi's work, he is an absolute titan of thinking and basically taking a lot of the cutting edge of what is out there and available in terms of actual analytics and statistics work and implementing that. And so Georgi has done a ton of the work that has basically taken all of these academic papers and the things that have been happening in the world of academia and translating them into actual tools that people can use. So if you're ever interested, he runs WebFocus and runs analyticstoolkit.com. Fantastic resources, absolutely like best in class write-ups of common statistics, common definitions, really good blog posts explaining things. So I would highly recommend checking out his work. And I just wanted to thank him very much. And the second person I wanted to acknowledge was, of course, Merritt Aho. Merritt was the person who built the first version of Search Discovery's sequential testing calculator and did a lot of the work of basically taking the idea is that Georgie has done such a fantastic job of explaining, and all of the academic work and all of the tools that have shown up in the industry around it, and synthesizing those into a little bit easier package for people to do this and run their own sequential design tests. So I wanted to thank both of them. And also I won't go into tons of detail around the originating research, but of course we would not be here if it were not for their work. And also Kevin Anderson, who I believe was at Merck when he developed the GS design package, which is what is running a lot of our stuff in the back end. So thank you all again, and setting that aside, let's actually get into it. So again, this is probably going to be pretty basic, pretty fundamental for most of you all, but it's just good to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we talk about testing, there is one thing that we're fundamentally trying to avoid, and that is to be fooled. And Soren Kierkegaard, Dutch, I always forget, philosopher, has this really great quote, which is that there are two ways to be fooled. The first way is to believe what isn't true. And the second way is to refuse to believe what is true. So we as experimenters and optimizers, we want to avoid being fooled by what we're observing. And there are basically two failure modes for that. The first is to believe what isn't true, and the second is to refuse to believe what is true. And now I'm going to introduce the hokey metaphor of the day, which all of you will be rolling your eyes at by the end of this presentation. But I have found it to be pretty helpful as we talk through this again, just for let's talk about this in very practical, intuitive terms. Let's not get hung up so much on the specifics of the math and background, because that's really valuable, but that's not the point of why we develop these tools. We want to make it more accessible for more folks to be able to talk about this, product managers, growth managers, people like that, to think about sequential testing as another tool in their toolbox, particularly as they're considering running other types of experiments. So how do we avoid being fooled? So I want to introduce us to a magical scenario where we are working on a very large farm here in the Midwest, and we are the chief needle inspector for the farm. We want to be certain that when our farm is shipping stacks of hay out to customers, that there are not needles in that hay. We're not going to worry too much about why the needles are showing up in the hay, but it is a problem and we have to avoid it. But our job is that we're the chief needle inspector. We have to make sure that needles are not showing up. But as is probably the reality of most of our jobs, we don't have enough time to do everything that we want to in a single day. And so we cannot spend all day digging through every single haystack on the farm. So we should start thinking about this in the frame of two different questions. And the first of those questions is, how much hay should we inspect before we can conclude that any needles that we have found are a good estimate for the rest of the stack? So that's this first question we want to have in our mind. And the second question we want to have is, how much hay should we inspect before we can conclude that there aren't any needles at all in a given haystack? So those are these two questions that, as we navigate the farm, we inspect hay, bales of hay. I'm going to get that mixed up tons as we talk here today. But as we inspect bales of hay, we want to be asking ourselves those questions, because that's helping us operationalize this risk model of, we can be fooled by things that we're observing. How do we make sure that we're avoiding that, or trying to reduce the likelihood of that happening, basically? So to dig a little bit more into this first question, how much hay should we inspect before we can conclude that any needles we found so far are a good estimate for the rest of the stack? So again, it is impractical for us to inspect the whole haystack. So instead, we need to plan ahead of time for the right balance of effort versus certainty. How much time and effort am I going to expend looking through this haystack to arrive at a certain degree of certainty about my conclusions about said haystack? Surprise, this is statistical significance. This is what is hopefully a more intuitive explanation that you all can carry to other folks that you work with, or folks who are starting their journey into learning experimental statistics. But statistical significance determines our level of certainty that anything that we have seen so far is representative of the rest of this haystack. As chief hay inspector, I have a little basket next to me. I reach into the hay bale, I grab a handful out, I pick through it, make sure that there's no needles inside of it. I set that aside in my little basket off to the side, and I continue doing that. And I just have to find the right balance between how much work am I doing, how many of these handfuls am I going to grab before I can make conclusions about the rest of the haystack. So that's statistical significance. It's that whatever we have seen is representative of the rest of the haystack, any needles that we found, any hay that we've looked at. So that's significance. Moving on to the second question, this how much hay should we inspect before we can conclude that there aren't any needles at all? Again, we only have so many hours in a day. It is impractical for us to exhaustively search the entire haystack, hay bale, to make sure that there are no needles whatsoever inside of it. We have to take samples from each of these, and we have to make determinations or draw conclusions, draw inferences from those. And again, this is where we introduce ourselves to another common statistical concept that many of us are probably familiar with: statistical power. This is determining our level of certainty that if there are needles to be found, we will have found some evidence of them. So again, I am reaching into the hay bale, I'm pulling out handfuls, I'm not finding any needles. At what point do I cut myself off and say, I am not going to find something in this haystack, I'm not going to find needles? Because again, I cannot spend all day. Sometimes, who knows, I want to come in on a Saturday and spend all day really deep diving on one just to make sure that my intuition is still pretty good. But realistically, our Monday through Friday regular work schedule, we're just not going to do that. So why am I obsessing so much about a hay bale or a farm full of hay bales? Again, this haystack example is statistics in practice. It is impractical for us to inspect the entire haystack to count how many needles there are. So instead, we are looking for evidence and we are inferring estimates from it. And so I want to introduce us to a little chart here, which is that there's kind of these two different slices of reality. Reality is the realm of these empty cells in the middle here, and there's different slices or different perspectives we can have on that. There's the first perspective, which is the hay that we've inspected so far. We are looking for needles in the handfuls that we're pulling out of the hay bale. That is one way that we can look at reality. Another slice or another perspective on reality is going to be the whole haystack. We could spend the time to look through the entire thing and arrive at a very conclusive version of reality, or a conclusive evaluation of what reality is. But again, that's not a good use of our time. So instead, we want to figure out how we can relate this first perspective, the hay that we've inspected, against the broader perspective, the broader truth that we're actually interested in discovering. So there are two different states of reality for both of these different slices. There's this version of the hay that we've inspected where we have some needles, and there's the one where there's no needles. And the same thing goes for the whole haystack, some needles versus no needles. We're trying to map between these two. And again, not going to shock anybody, but in the case where we find some needles in the hay that we've inspected so far, that we've put off in our little basket, that is the true positive, where that reflects the broader reality of the broader haystack. And conversely, the true negative is where we find no needles in the hay that we've inspected, and we have no needles in the whole haystack. So we're trying to guide ourselves between these two and basically make the determination of, are we looking at a true positive or a true negative? And to make this really explicit for everybody, in A/B testing, we're looking for evidence of a difference between A and B, our control, our variant, our control, and our challenger, whatever we want to call those. We have an existing version of an experience. We have a new version we want to try out. And we're trying to look for evidence of a difference between those and then determine how much certainty we have in the evidence of that difference. And also just to remind everyone, positive and negative here have no inherent value. They're just describing the presence or absence of evidence. Positive is when we do have evidence of there being a change. Negative is when there's an absence of evidence. So to put this in more explicit terms, again, the test we've run, this is the hay that we've inspected so far. And the true result in reality is if we were able to enter the quantum realm, do some crazy, pseudoscience stuff, where we were to look at what are the different versions of reality, what is the counterfactual version of reality, where instead of the control version of our website, our application, our checkout flow, whatever it is, with the control version that is being exposed to everyone, where there's the alternative counterfactual version of reality where everyone is exposed to this one. We're trying to make estimates about the contrast between those and understand what that true difference is. And again, we're trying to guide ourselves between the true positive or the true negative. Now, of course, there are these empty spaces on this plot. What are those about? So again, going back to statistical significance, significance is determining a level of certainty that any evidence we found is representative of a true cause and effect relationship and not some random coincidence. We live in an entropic universe. Weird stuff happens all the time. In our hay bale example, I could have my little satchel of needles that I've collected, because of course I don't want to drop those back into the hay bales after I've inspected them. It could be that I it gets caught on something, rips open, drops a bunch of needles back into a hay bale. Stuff happens. We have erroneous data that is collected as part of experiments. We have sample ratio mismatch indicating that there are problems with our experiments that we're running. All kinds of weird things can happen in the universe, and we're just trying to reduce the likelihood that anything we're seeing is because of that random coincidence, as opposed to something that we've tried to induce with a change in the experience that we're testing. So statistical significance is basically helping us avoid or try to make sure that we're ending up with a true positive and not a false detection. False detection is when we end up in these cases where, oops, I did drop a bunch of needles into the haystack and didn't realize I did it. That's what we're trying to avoid. Statistical significance, by increasing the threshold of certainty that we're holding ourselves to, helps us end up with a true positive and avoid false detections. And by that same token, statistical power determines our level of certainty that if there's a difference to be found, we would have found evidence of it. And this is where we talk about the difference between a failure to detect and the true negative. Failure to detect is just that if we were to continue inspecting things, we would eventually find evidence. It's just that so far we haven't been able to. That's a failure to detect what is happening. In statistical power, again, by increasing the threshold that we're holding ourselves to for that, that's what helps us avoid for that or control for that in our experimentation.
Did Matt freeze for everybody, or am I the only one who froze?
He froze.
Okay, I'm gonna ping him.
Awesome, cool. So, oh, well, sorry, was there actually a question, or am I just too excited?
No, you just froze for a minute, but you're good.
Oh, okay, cool. Then hi, everybody, I'm back. Yeah, if we don't have any questions, like throw them out in the chat. Kelly's always does a great job of keeping an eye out for those. And I will do my best to notice when she's desperately trying to get my attention, because I get too excited and carried away with presenting these things. But yeah, so I just, again, a lot of this stuff is probably review for y'all, but I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page, because this stuff is really critical for when we communicate to stakeholders why sequential testing is valuable. Just having these intuitive explanations of these things is really good to have. Makes that conversation a lot easier. So the basic testing lifecycle, let's review how we typically run fixed horizon tests. So fixed horizon, fixed sample, you've probably heard different terms, but it's basically the way that we've run A/B tests for ages, which is we run a calculation before we run an experiment, for we want to collect a certain amount of data, let's go do it. But before we even get to that, let's just remind ourselves of the good things we should do as experimenters. So we need to start with a hypothesis statement. We start with an if, a then, and a because. We stitch those together into a nice, concise statement of, if we do something, we expect it to have a certain effect. And then why do we think that's going to be, or why do we think that effect is going to take place? So for argument's sake, we're going to test a percentage off versus dollar off offer on the homepage. And we expect this to increase the offer take rate. How many people are taking this savings offer coupon that's being shown on a banner at the top of the homepage? And the reason that we believe that, the because, is voice of customer feedback suggests that showing actual dollar savings can actually lead customers to focus on the total cost instead of the total savings. If we say $10 off of $100, they're going to be like, gosh, $100 is still pretty expensive, even if I'm getting it down to 90, 10%. They're like, wow, what a great deal. I normally only see discounts of 3 to 5% or something like that. We can reframe that for them and hopefully increase the number of people who take that offer and end up converting. So we start with this and we stitch it together into the final hypothesis statement. So it's always good for us to do that. Again, probably I'm boring you to tears by reminding you of this, but it's really important. But what do we do after we have gotten that? We get into the rest of the test planning. And so we start with a good hypothesis, and we always want to make sure that we have decision plans, all of our other good best practices and kind of experimental design hygiene, but things we need to take into consideration. What do we need to think about next? Statistical power level. So like we just said, how much evidence do we look at before, or how much evidence do we look for before we give up and say there's no difference between these? Statistical significance. What is the threshold that we're going to set for, hey, once we've gotten a certain amount of evidence, we're going to feel pretty good about this. When can we walk away from this experiment feeling good about the results and feel like we found a real difference? Type of test. We're going to be talking more about this in a second, but Are we running a fixed horizon test? Are we running a longer, different test design? Pseudo or quasi-experimental designs, that kind of thing can influence this. The number of variations. Are we testing one challenger? Are we testing multiple challengers against our control? All of these things fit in together. Traffic volume, of course. The conversion rate for the primary KPI. All of these things fit together, and they are many, many, many levers on the same experimental design box that, you pull one, 3 of them are going to shift around in ways that you wouldn't expect necessarily. And that's just the nature of doing experimental design. But the last thing that we need to consider is the MDE. And what is the MDE? It is perhaps the most frustrating part of test planning, which is that it is the minimum detectable effect. And so when we talk about developing experimental designs, and when we talk about running A/B tests, we want to think about how much data do I need to go collect, and what is the amount of evidence that I'm looking for? And that is helping us make determinations about what the appropriate statistical power, statistical significance, those things, these concepts are related to one another. But at the end of the day, we have to figure out what is the difference and how big of a difference do we have to see before we can care about the result? And this, we've all probably had these experiences. Someone wants to run an experiment and they say they want to run a test and look for, a 50% lift in order conversion rate, which for many of us we would probably say, gosh, that's a little bit unrealistic. That's probably very unlikely to happen inside of this experiment. Or people run for really small, like fine grain changes, like, hey, a 2% increase would be really meaningful for the business over the long run, but that's going to take a long time for us to run a test and arrive at a statistically meaningful, a statistically robust result. So how do we know before we run an experiment how much of an impact our changes are going to have? And the answer is, frankly, we don't. If we did have a good answer for it, we would not be in the business of experimentation. There would not be a whole point in running experiments. If we knew what was going to happen based on the actions we were going to take, we would all be out of jobs. And I think we're all pretty fond of being able to, get paid and do the work that we enjoy doing. But what else can we frame this as? Well, we can frame it as the then from our hypothesis statement. So if we're looking at this one, if we show percentage savings offer on the homepage, then take rate will increase because customers will better understand the value proposition. That then statement is saying, this is our primary KPI, and this is where we can get really specific about when we should care about this value. Like, is it going to be 5% increase in take rate? Is it going to be a 10% increase in take rate? That's where we can figure this out. But there are many common pitfalls as we run this, because again, there's no way of knowing until we've already done it. And this is why I love talking about causal inference and kind of quasi-experimental designs. We can get into all kinds of goofy territory, but for most people, we want to answer these things with A/B tests. But what typically happens? Well, one of the most common pitfalls is that we see the nothing. People run an experiment and they get a flat result, and you have no idea why. And you end up asking yourself, was me running this experiment a waste of time? That is a real bummer of, I've been waiting for this really hotly anticipated A/B test to be running for, a month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever it is. Tons of executive buy-in, and it ends up being flat. What do you do? Like, how do you make decisions about what to do next? Another common pitfall is the holdup. Oftentimes we realize that the experiments we're running are having results that actually we could not have anticipated because they were way bigger than we could have imagined. Moving the add to bag button on our product detail pages can have a huge impact. And sometimes that can take us totally by surprise. And sometimes it can be very bad. Like, hey, we moved the add to bag button and it turns out no one can find it, and we're killing the site-wide conversion rate. No one's adding stuff to their carts. That's really bad. Or it can be a very pleasant surprise. Like, hey, we got a much bigger positive impact from the result of our changes. And what you can end up in the situation is when you go to your stakeholders or your boss, it's like, well, why didn't we call this sooner? It seems pretty obvious. I'm not a big sports person, but the analogy that comes to mind is hey, you're getting to halftime at the football game. It's a total blowout. It's 42-0. Is it time for us to leave the game because it's not particularly fun to watch one team get totally, get totally owned by the other team? And should we just leave and avoid the traffic? By calling things early, we can make better decisions. So that's another common pitfall that we see. And finally, the not quite. Your challenger did pretty well, but not quite well enough. And you find yourself asking, well, there's an opportunity cost of running experiments. Do I really want to bother retesting this based on this assumption that I made about the MDE, which was that I frankly made my MDE just a little bit further than what reality told us. And the responsible thing to do as experimenters is, well, we just rerun the test, but no one likes doing that. It's a bummer, and it's not a good use of resources. So we can try to catch a lot of this with a couple of just very simple tricks of the trade. Start with your calendar, figure out how long can we plausibly run an experiment, what business constraints do you need to take into account. You can check historical data, look for past experiments that were similar. Past test lists, MDEs can give you a decent idea of what you should be looking for or what you can kind of anticipate. And then finally, have a plan. What will you do when you monitor and end your test? And decision plans have come up in conversation in the TLC before, but it's basically like have a plan written down for what you're going to do in certain eventualities. It makes testing a lot easier. And Kelly, remind me if we've actually run anything, or if you've run anything recently for decision plans, because I know we've been talking about it a whole bunch with some of our stuff with search discovery, but might be another topic to cover at some point. But yeah, but it's basically like these are good things to do. These are good practices, good experimental hygiene, as I said. But hey, why don't we just check our results sooner? There's this whole thing of like, we've probably heard like, yeah, we like run A/B tests, don't look at them, don't peek at your results. But why can't we just look? Like, we can avoid all these problems that would crop up earlier. We can, like, if the test is totally blowing it, then we don't have to worry about it. We can just turn it off. Or if it's not doing anything, we can just shut it down. Again, we can make decisions faster. Why not do that? And this is the problem of peaking and multiple testing. This is the why behind sequential testing. This is why we care about this stuff. So when we talk about making multiple measurements, checking in on a test, peeking at results, this is when we're saying, it's 10 days in, we have a 30-day runtime. I'm just going to look at the results. I'll throw in a statistical significance calculator. What's the harm in that? There's a lot of harm, actually. When we make multiple evaluations, or when we try to take multiple measurements from the same experiment over time, we're actually increasing the likelihood that at least one of those checks is going to give us something that is actually misleading. Again, it's going to be one of those false positives. That's the big risk that we're trying to minimize here, is that because we check, or as we check things over and over again, we're continually flipping the dice, or we're rolling the dice as to whether or not we're going to get a weird result. Again, we live in a strange universe. Bizarre stuff happens all the time. We're rolling the dice on whether that random stuff is going to show up and make us think that we found something more meaningful. But what actually happens when we peak? This is a simulation that was done, which is basically looking for controlled conditions around a zero, a null effect. There's no actual difference between our A and B, and we're just simulating the results coming out of this. If we run these simulations for this, and we check in at 10% of our estimated sample size for each of these. So for the sample size was, 66,000. So if we check in at 6.6 thousand, 12 point, this is why I have computers to do math for me. You get the idea. But if we check in at these like 10% intervals, there's a very high likelihood that we're actually going to end up drawing a false conclusion if we stop the experiment at the point where we find something that looks statistically significant. The first checkpoint, 10%, 5%, 3%, it declines over time. So as we get closer to the end of the experiment, the likelihood of us having a false positive ends up being relatively small. But if we sum all those up, it's like a 30% chance that we can draw a false positive. We can draw a bad conclusion from the results where we say there was evidence of a difference, but in reality there wasn't. Again, it's these two different slices or perspectives on reality. So we care about this because this is how we avoid this. And the TLDR is just that there's a pretty good chance that you're going to shoot yourself in the foot by calling a test early if you're not being careful. It varies by test design. It varies by the the measurement criteria you're using, but more often than not, false positives are just a fact of life, and you have to control for those. And this is what we talk about when we talk about error inflation. So when we talk about errors, when we talk about false positives, this is a different slice of the data for those simulations. These red ones are ones that ended up being false positives at the end of the runtime. And we can see that those were there. But if we end up with stopping early based on these, we end up with a lot more of those, and we make bad decisions. So again, we're rolling the dice every single time. And it's not that it's this cumulative, like, it's not a compounding risk, it's a cumulative risk, which is that we only need to make a bad conclusion once. That's how we make decisions. We find evidence for something and we say that we're going to go take action on that. But the reality is that we should only be limiting the opportunity for us to make that mistake. We need to rein that in. We need to control for it. And this is the same thing with Bayesian testing as well. This stuff happens. This is common across frequent test Bayesian. Like, there's not an advantage here. False positives are just a fact of statistics. When we try to look at the world, draw inferences from samples of data, this is just the fact. These are the facts of life. So this is why we talk about, when people talk about testing to significance, this is why it's like, hey, hold up, don't do that. And if you are going to do it, then it's best to understand the rule before you break it. And peaking is just so tempting because you can reduce overall project length. You can launch other experiments that you have in your queue. You can limit exposure, poor experiences, monetize a valuable change, appease eager stakeholders. Like, there's just all kinds of things that we can do. And the temptation is so real that we want to do it all the time. But unless we control for the increased risk, we're doing something very foolish. And one of the things that we can do, or that some folks have done for some time, is use something called Bonferroni correction, or one of the many other correction methods which are available, which is like, hey, for every time we make an additional comparison, every time we check in on this test, we're going to basically impose a penalty on our statistical significance threshold that says it's harder for us to draw a bad conclusion based on this by paying that penalty. The problem is that it's way it's way too conservative. It overcompensates, and it's not actually helping us make better decisions. So instead, I would like us to talk about the core principles of sequential testing as a better way to run experiments. So we're going to cover some core principles, and then we're going to actually get into the fun stuff, I promise. But this is beyond casual A/B testing. And the way that we end up with an alpha, so alpha is a representation of basically the statistical significance threshold we're looking for. How much risk are we willing to tolerate? Instead of us just cutting that in half or cutting that in thirds or applying these really arbitrary penalties for, like Bonferroni does or many of these other corrections do, instead we can do something which is called error spending. By spending the amount of risk that we're taking on over time, we take on a little bit of risk at the beginning, take on a little bit more as we get further into the experiment, then we take on the bulk of the risk at the end of the experiment. We can actually limit the likelihood that we're going to draw a bad conclusion the same way we would with a fixed horizon A/B test, no peaking, except we get a lot of the advantages of peaking. We can still call stuff when it's really blowing our expectations out of the water way earlier than we would have otherwise. And this alpha spending thing, this error spending function, is what is really critical. And so when I talked about all the academic research that's been done, these alpha spending and power spending functions are well researched. The one that we're using for our calculator is one called Kim Demetz, but there's lots of different ways to get into this. If you're ever interested, always love talking shop about this kind of thing. So please feel free to hit me up on the TLC or wherever. But we want to spend our appetite for risk over time so that we don't do something foolish, but we can actually make some better decisions along the way. And the other way that we can do this is by using z-scores. So z-scores are a representation of the results of the z-test, which is the statistic that we can use to evaluate test results. There are different ways to slice this. Just the particular implementation that Merritt went with, and I've continued forward, is we can z-test over time, and we can make sure that we're not drawing bad inferences. And Charles, I would love to talk to you more about that. This is a very specific mode of testing, and this is absolutely not for everyone. This is just the hey, we tried to sand off a lot of the rough corners on this and make it approachable for folks, but you absolutely can get more aggressive with more dynamic ways of running experiments with, and just basically evaluating your risk at different points. But z-scores, basically, rather than us talking about p-values and confidence scores, whatever our testing tools are telling us, z-scores are just a little bit easier for us to make determinations about, because they're shifting around a little bit less, at least with the way that we've implemented this. And so what happens is that, again, by spending our risk at different points, we're basically building a cone around the desired effect or the desired result that we want to have, which is that we end up with a winning test. But we want to say that there's an upper bound. So this upper bound is saying that if our challenger crosses this upper boundary at any point, we can feel pretty darn confident that this is at least as good as the minimum detectable effect that we had specified as part of our experimental design. The lower boundary is basically just saying, hey, if it falls below this, it probably means this is not something that we should continue doing. It means that it's pretty unlikely that this challenger is going to be able to turn things around and get back to a point where we would call it a winner, where it's greater than our minimum detectable effect. And this lower boundary is what we call a binding boundary. This is the kind of thing where when we design these things, if you cross the lower boundary, you almost always need to end the experiment. You can specify it such that you don't have to, but it's relatively efficient to do it in this way, where the binding lower boundary is the one that lets you continue. The flip side is that the non-binding boundary is what we set our upper boundary to be, which is if we cross that upper boundary, amazing. We probably have a winner, but we can continue running the test if we want to really feel confident in the result, or to continue building confidence and certainty in the evidence that we've collected. And that's the kind of thing we can do with this. Again, there are multiple approaches to sequential testing. So Charles, I would actually love to get this rolled up as part of whatever the citations or references you're talking about. I would love to get those included as a resource for folks, to make sure that folks know that there are other ways of doing this. Again, this is just a pretty straightforward implementation of it, but Optimizely stats engine, and many of the other platform stats engines at this point are using some variation of this kind of alpha spending or error spending function to control the way that they run experiments. And with all of that said, let's actually do the fun stuff, which is the actual application. So again, as is the nature of trying to run live demos, is that things will go wrong as we're trying to get them uploaded. So again, this version of the calculator is going to be going live soon. We just want to make sure that we fully kick the tires before we light the fires, as it were. But with that said, let's actually dive into it. So this is the updated version of the sequential testing calculator. And there's basically, there's two distinct phases of when we talk about designing an experiment. There's planning, and then there's monitoring and analysis. And we've tried to reflect that in the way that we do this. It is that we want to, as we would do in most experimental designs, we need to understand how much traffic are we typically getting over a time range, what is our baseline conversion rate, and how many variations versus control. Are we doing one challenger versus control, 2, 3, et cetera, et cetera. This calculator does by default control for multiple comparisons using the CDAC correction, which was a recommendation by Georgie a while ago. So again, thank you to him for being incredible. But this is what is letting us control for. If we're running multiple variations in parallel against control, we can do that in a safer way. But when we plug in all these different, when we pull all these levers, we plug in these different values. We can adjust our power levels. We can adjust our confidence levels. We can switch from one-tailed to two-tailed. What this is going to give us is a recommended sample size for us to run to. And it's going to compare the difference between the fixed horizon sample size, which is the one where we're not supposed to peak. We just run that. We launch the test. We don't look. We're going to close our eyes. We're going to blindfold ourselves. We're not going to look at it until it's done. And then there's this sequential version of this test, which is going to, the reality is that it is going to run longer. That alpha spending function is not perfect. It is not going to be able to perfectly replicate it in the same way, but the additional sample size that it needs is one, usually pretty modest, and two, as human beings, we're really bad at estimating the actual, the minimum detectable effect, or estimating the actual effect of changes that we make. And because we are typically really bad at that, even though the worst case scenario, like the way that I have this designed right now, let me adjust that back up to 95. For a 95% confidence level or statistical significance level, if you translate that back to your p-value, and an 80% power level with a one-tailed test, with a fixed horizon sample size per variation, we're going to need 45,000, just under 45,500. So we're going to do just under that. So about 34 days based on the total amount of traffic that we've included here. The sequential sample size is 49,900, so 37 days. So we're adding 3 days worth of testing time, which is not ideal, not great. But you just have to remind yourself that it's very rare that you're going to end up in that. And so the question I want you all to ask yourselves is, do I feel more confident in my ability to accurately guess the impact of the changes that I am making in an experiment versus my ability to game a system where I can check in on results multiple times? Personally, I'm the type of person where I'm going to say, hey, actually, I prefer the more structured system where I can feel like I'm bending the rules, but in a way that's safe because I know what I'm doing in that case. And I know way better than guessing the results of tests that I've run. I've had betting pools with people on experimentation teams before, and it's always just at the end of the year, it's like, yep, the betting pool was flat. No one actually made any money because we're all terrible at actually calling winners for experiments. That's just the reality of how experimentation goes. And we can also play around with target MDE and the total number of checkpoints. And I think the key thing to remember is that we can increase the number of times that we check in on the experiment, the number of times that we're spending our error or our alpha to check in on the results of the test. So, and if you only wanted to do like one midpoint check-in, like just one check, then you could specify that. And you can see that the length of the sequential test is only 4.2% longer. So in that case, because we're only checking in once, we do not have to worry about this as much. We can, we're basically like, we're minimizing the amount of inefficiency that we're adding on for this additional level of certainty. And as we increase that, that's typically going to start increasing that longer and longer and longer. Just ballpark guideline, just tie it to a decent business cycle. Like if it's going to have to run for 2 months, check it every other week, or design it in such a way that's going to make sense, make it easier for people to check in. This calculator is good about actually, it will update itself dynamically for, oh shoot, I was supposed to monitor that last Tuesday and I didn't look at it. If you input the data and you miss a checkpoint, it's all good. It's totally fine. It's still going to work. But we've now designed our experiment, which is that we have an estimated runtime. We know how much sample we're looking for. We've planned the number of checkpoints that we need to be able to look at for us to make conclusions based on our experiment. And now we've launched it. Hooray, we've gotten to launch, we've checked it, we've made sure that nothing weird is happening technically, data is flowing in, all things are going well. And that's when we get to switch into monitoring and analysis. So first, we just have a simplified data entry. One of the big pieces of feedback that we got from our clients, folks we work with, even our teams internally, was just that previous versions of this calculator, it was very cumbersome to load in data for the way that we run experiments. And we have been trying to find other ways to simplify that. If you are the kind of person who likes point and click interfaces, I'm sorry, we can try to restore that at some point if you're really interested. But the reality is that we're people who work in data and business. We're working in spreadsheets all the time. So what we can actually do now is that we have a rough, basically, template for what your results should look like. The critical thing is just that you have 4 columns: checkpoint, variation, total, and converted. And I can actually copy these over, and these are going to pop into our tool. So it's just as simple as that. I can copy it from Sheets, Excel, whatever I want it to be. I can paste it in there and it's going to evaluate that. We have a little data preview here to tell us what is going on inside of the data, just to make sure that things got ingested correctly. But now we have our data. We're ready to do analysis, and we can check in on our different checkpoints. And if you would like a template to work off of, you can click on this link and it is going to give you a link to a templated version of this. And as we make updates to the calculator, as we continue optimizing this, we will add more explanation, we'll add some context, we'll have links to other educational resources along the way for, here's how you can make this work the way you want it to. But it's fundamentally, we just need to be able to map how much traffic, how much total traffic for our for each variation has it gotten at each checkpoint, and then how much of that traffic is basically converted. So this is a visitor or visit or user-based metric. It's not something that is looking at like raw number of conversions that will screw things up. If you do that, if you want to do that, please talk to me. Reach out and we can try to find other ways to accommodate it. But this is something that is still fundamentally pretty much focused on conversion rate-based analyses, conversion rate-based testing. So we've now uploaded our data. Whoop-de-doo, we have a table, congratulations. And now we can actually do the analysis summary, which of course is not behaving now that I've tried to load it up. Let me see if I can get this to play nicely. There we go. Probably just, these are the lovely timing out things that I was trying to resolve in a sweaty mess before I got on the call this morning. But we have the data that has been loaded in, and this is what is going to show up in our decision boundary plot. So for that first check-in where there's only a 33 visitor conversion difference, like an actual difference between our control and variation for this first checkpoint, that Z-score, the representation of that change, very small at that point. And what that's being reflected as in this plot is that is falling into the central white region. That is this cone of uncertainty. We just can't make decisions about what is happening inside with the test yet. And as we move into our second observation, and I'll just copy this back over so that I don't have to keep flipping back and forth like this. For this second checkpoint, we have like a 3.3% lift at our first checkpoint and then 2.5% checkpoint, or 2.5% lift at our second checkpoint. That's actually contracted a little bit. So we can see that that Z-score has actually dropped off some. That's now a smaller value, but it's still within this cone of uncertainty. But for the third checkpoint, we actually see that there's a big jump. There's a big difference in performance. This happens. Sometimes trends are not stationary or not stable in the experiments that we run. It just is what it is. And we can see that we now have a 13.3% lift. And at that point in time, that is now large enough to cross our upper decision boundary. That's gone into this upper cyan region, which is the congrats, you probably have a winner, and you can probably feel pretty confident that that winner is winning by an amount which is as large as your minimum detectable effect. If you want to be really precise about your the size of the effect size, this may not be the best way to do it. It's just a really good way to get to, do I think that this is winning by at least this much? That's the right way to think about this. And the flip side, of course, is that if it's going into the lower red region, then it's like, hey, this lost, it's somewhere below our minimum detectable effect. We shouldn't consider this a winner. But this is the updated version of the calculator. Hopefully this is easier for folks to use. And again, I will stress, please reach out with feedback and suggestions for this, because I want this to be a tool that is easier for folks to use. Again, there are tons of different ways to slice this up. And Charles, I'm absolutely going to read more on the stuff that you were sending in the Zoom chat for different ways that we could potentially implement this. But this is the way that you can run sequential tests. It makes it that much easier to say, I can check in on my results. I can peek, and I don't have to worry about it too much. Now, to wrap things up, I do want to introduce one more wrinkle, which is, could we maybe just do more simply with more stringent stopping rules? And this is something that actually Ronnie Kohavi, he has an amazing kind of A/B testing and experimentation course, which I've taken. It's fantastic, well worth the money. But when we start seeing enormous shifts in performance. If any of you have heard Twyman's law, it's basically any figure that looks interesting or different is actually usually wrong. It's this, going back to what Kelly introduced me with, nothing makes me more suspicious than good news. Something that looks good is almost always wrong, or at least is something that we should treat with extreme skepticism until we've been able to prove it out further. And this is the one thing where these tests can maybe get a little bit wonky, which is that if you do suddenly have, say, a shift in site performance, or there's a bug in control that's not actually affecting your challenger, that can result in a sudden huge spike in performance, like we were discussing with this test where we see, this was kind of petering off and then jump back up again. That does happen in testing, but it's the kind of thing we want to be careful about. And I think that there is an argument to be made for, if we just got more stringent with our stopping rules, if we basically limit ourselves to tighter and tighter p-values, increase our threshold of certainty that we have to reach with statistical significance to arrive at a conclusion we feel good about, that can also catch a lot of these things. But again, that doesn't help us with we can stop tests early. We can't make better decisions about that. And so this is part of a larger conversation around decision science, decision frameworks. How do you make better decisions given the resources and constraints that you're facing? So with that, I will remind everyone, the updated calculator will be going live very soon as I've been able to iron out these last few problems. But we have a ton of other resources on our calculators and resources page on searchdiscovery.com. We would love people using those, giving us feedback on how they're working. Please reach out to us on the TLC. Anywhere else on the internet, I'm usually game to talk about stats pretty much whenever. And you can probably find me pretty easily with my name, but please reach out, let us know, talk to us. And with that, we've got some time for questions if folks have them. And I will also say thank you so much for listening to me ramble and for being patient.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. And I just want to say I took a bunch of notes over on the TLC calls channel. I grabbed the links that were in your deck and put them over there. I want to ask, can I share a PDF version of your deck with the TLC?
Yes, please, please, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I will grab it and I will post it on the TLC community. And then I will also send it to the email list in case anybody can't get to the Slack. I also posted a link to Ronnie's class that Matt just mentioned. If you all use that link, you'll get a $50 Amazon gift card if you attend. I was lucky enough to be able to go to Ronnie's last cohort class, and he gave me a little discount link for you guys. So not a discount, but you get a $50 Amazon gift card if you sign up with that link. So it really is a great class, and like Matt said, so that's pretty cool. Questions? And then we'll do reminders about the next conversations that we've got coming up. We've got about 5 minutes.
I have a question.
I'll allow it.
Thank you. Matt, really great presentation. One thing that puzzles me a little bit is for MDEs, a lot of people use the percentage lift seems to be the common standard in industry. I wonder why no one really uses like effect sizes, because to me, especially for continuous metrics, like effect sizes incorporate not just the mean difference, but also the variance as well. So to me, it seems to be a much better metric to look at MD. And I just was wondering if you have any insight about like why effect sizes are not more commonly used in industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective on it, and this is very much like realm of personal opinion, not something that's like, here's what the book says in some place. I don't have a strong citational apparatus for that. I think it's that the reality is that for many folks running experimentation programs, or at least from the kind of realm of the marketing, we're using client-side testing tools, just kind of like running testing as before experimentation got to be like, no, product teams, people doing stuff with really complicated metrics became as much of a thing. I think it's that MD is really convenient because when we talk about relative lifts in percentage terms, it's much easier to make apples and oranges comparisons basically across those. For if we make a design change, I come from like a lot of ecom experience, and so my examples tend to skew that way. But for something like a PDP, if we make a change to a CTA on the PDP and we say that that has a 5% lift to engagement rate for a given CTA, like the add to bag button, we can say, oh, interesting. When we switch from say a ghost or outline style CTA to a solid color CTA, we saw a 5% lift. What if we try that in a different application elsewhere on the website? Can we see a similar lift? Can we see a similar relative change? That's how I've always kind of rationalized it. But to your point, I think it's generally pretty good when people get pretty concrete about what their changes actually mean. It's just that it's also, I think the other complicating factor is like time horizon for experiment. When we talk about time horizons for a test running on one page runs for 60 days, another test runs for 90 days. If people are trying to do apples and oranges comparisons there, again, I don't think it's anything malicious. It's just oftentimes like day-to-day stakeholders or people who are overseeing experimentation, they're not good at remembering the actual effect size in like real terms is fixed to the denominator of what that would have been, like time range, how many visitors came through, that kind of thing. That's at least my explanation for it. I would also happily hear from anyone else who sees it differently, because I don't think that should be like a canonical answer.
Thanks a lot.
Matt, I tried to capture your answer, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in the TLC calls, and I want you to go over there and totally tear that apart and edit it for correction, and then I will delete that.
Okay, yeah, I'll set a reminder
I'm
for
not
myself.
sure I did a good job.
No, I'm sure you did fine. You're able to catch up with me. You're able to follow me when I'm just like moving at lightning speed, rambling through stuff. So
we both know how fast you talk.
Yes, it's known. I still have my slow down post-it that you recommended at the top of my monitor. So,
Anyone else have any final questions?
Actually, I did have one question. To your point, Matt, around the difference in variance in a number of days, the impact of seasonality. How would you go about adjusting or trying to compare an apples to apples when there is a difference in when you're running these tests and the timing of them?
Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer, because that's where I tend to like duck and cover and just say, can't we just say that better is good enough? But no, if we want to be like real about it, I think that again, percentage lift is reasonably good at blunting some of the effects of that. But I think that realistically, like if you are seeing, to my mind, again, my brain is e-commerce poisoned. But if we're talking about like running tests over Black Friday weekend, that's just one of those of like, hey, I don't think that we should actually make comparisons about magnitude of change for anything that we run in like the week before and after that, just because that seems like a bad idea. And the only way to validate it is to actually pull tests forward and try to revalidate those. Or you can maybe do counterfactuals, quasi-experimental analysis, but detrending that kind of stuff can be really challenging. And I don't want to like pretend that there's a easy bulletproof solution for doing it. Or if someone does have one, I would love to hear about it, because this is the kind of stuff that I get asked about all the time.
Love it. All right, that makes sense. That was kind of what I thought as well. I just wanted to, hey, if you had a magic bullet, why not ask, right?
Oh yeah, no, totally. I would love to have a, I would love to have a sheath full of magical bullets. I have my little testing bandle here that I would wear around all day with my A/B testing 6-shooter. I'm going to cut myself off there with that metaphor. But
Thank you.
Okay, quickly, the next couple of conversations in March, even though you don't have the invite yet, it should be Matt Gershoff coming to talk to us about combining qualitative and quantitative, and the reason that he got inspired to do that within the Conductrix platform with our own Paula Sappington of the TLC, and kind of how they do things at Hilton. And he's going to be talking about the reason for that, and it's a really interesting talk that he had at Super Week. And then April, I think you have that invite. Tone Vestling, also longtime member of the TLC, is going to be talking and sharing his talk from Super Week, which is, how to, reinvigorate your ideation pipeline, the different methods he uses. It's fantastic. And then we're going to have another talk in April from Dr. Ellie Weiss. If you haven't seen her in a while, she's been a little busy, and she's finally going to come back and chat with us. So really, really excited to have her back. And she's going to talk to us about the test and roll method. So start checking your calendars, and if you don't have your invites, reach out and let me know, and I'll make sure that you get those invites on your calendar. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everybody. And Matt, again, check my answers that I gave, update those, and then I'll delete my responses so that your answers are actually there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Take care. Bye.